Avowed has released, and it is Microsoft's next big RPG developed by Obsidian. I just finished my first playthrough, and I have a lot of things to say, so let's discuss. So, Avowed is a first-person action RPG set in the same universe of Pillars of Eternity, but it is a completely standalone game with its own characters, lore, and story. You don't have to have even heard of Pillars of Eternity to play this. The game plays like a combination of Skyrim and the Outer Worlds. If you told me to summarize the game into one sentence, I would say, Jack of all trades, master of none. It's actually astonishing how average Avowed is in every aspect. From its gameplay, to its characters, to its story. None of it was memorable, but none of it was bad either. Every part of the game was just safe. Obsidian is the student that turned in their science project, barely meeting every requirement, but still doing enough to pass. But does that make Avowed a game that is worth people's time? Let's discuss. The story, as I hinted at earlier, is just fine. FYI, there will be no spoilers, and anything specific I discuss will be information learned in the first 10 minutes. You play as the envoy sent to the Living Lands on a mission from the Emperor to combat the plague known as the Dream Scourge. You also happen to be a godlike, which is someone that has been blessed by one of the many gods. The story takes you all across the Living Lands, where you meet a variety of characters, all of who are fairly generic. Honestly, if you held me down and asked me to name a single character besides the main antagonists or the companions, I don't think I could. Like I said from the start, everything is very average, and that includes the NPCs. They do what their job is, to progress the main story. They give quests, provide information, or complain that the decision you made earlier in the story didn't align with their own personal agenda. That comes up a lot. Unfortunately, nothing about these characters goes above and beyond, and it's frankly disappointing. And remember, this isn't Ninja Gaiden, where the story is more of an extra. This is Obsidian Entertainment's next big RPG set in the Pillars of Eternity universe. We shouldn't have a bunch of copy and paste NPCs. Unfortunately, this aspect also carries over a bit to the companions, and they are definitely more memorable than the generic NPCs, but they still have pretty generic and basic backstories. Over the course of the game, the companions really just boiled down to fodder for the enemies to focus on while I recharge my health. I was trying to pinpoint why I struggled so much to develop any bond with these characters, and I think it boiled down to the introduction of these characters. Each one was just thrusted on your team with little to no introduction, and by the time their own personal story began to develop, I had already stopped caring. Plus, they're all just generic video game tropes and are fairly boring to talk to. As for the story, as mentioned earlier, you are a godlike and sent to stop a plague called the Dream Scourge. A similar theme follows the story in that it is distinctly average. It relies on similar fantasy tropes and backstories that have been used over and over. It plays everything very safe and doesn't overstep in any way. I will say I was surprised how impactful the decision-making was in the game on me. There are a few major choices you have to make that significantly impact the world, and I struggled at these points. There was one decision that I had to make later in the game that was so hard to make that I had to put the game down and come back later. I was honestly surprised because the story wasn't doing much for me, and I was just along for the ride, but the moral dilemmas Avowed put me through was frankly exhilarating. And these decisions aren't just random queries that don't mean anything. They really do change the world and how everyone looks at you. There was a point 10 hours after a Crossroads decision where people were still referencing that decision. It was really cool, and I loved how dynamic it made the world feel. It reminded me of Mass Effect, where one decision will completely change the way the world interacts with you. Now, is it enough to make me want to replay Avowed to see the other choices? No, but it was nice to see. Now, with saying this, I'm still happy that I experienced the story that Avowed offered. While it had a fairly generic story, the themes, which I'm not going to spoil, really do make you ponder, and I think that is the best thing Avowed's story does. And now we move on to the gameplay. Believe it or not, I found Avowed's gameplay to be distinctly average. Now, in no way was it bad, but there were so many ways I would improve it. My biggest gripe with the gameplay came down to how spongy the enemies were. I was playing on normal difficulty, and each fight was lasting upwards of 10 to 15 minutes. This was with grinding on the side, upgrading my gear, And now I'm fine with enemies that are a bit tanky, but it was getting to the point where even grunts were taking a beating. God forbid a bear comes strolling in. And I think the counter people would have to this is that you aren't grinding the game enough, but I'm of the opinion that I shouldn't have to grind for hours after each encounter just to do a moderate amount of damage to an enemy on normal difficulty. It just isn't fun. And that isn't what video games are supposed to be like. It got to the point in the game where I just turned the difficulty down to easy, and it takes a lot for me to do that. But I didn't feel like my skill was being put to the test, but how much I was willing to grind my level to do a bit more damage. Not everyone may feel this way, but for me, this just isn't good game design. I will say, once I turned the difficulty down a bit, I enjoyed the combat more. It does have a very Skyrim feel to it. You can equip a weapon in each hand or use a larger weapon with both hands. And there's a really nice variety of the gameplay styles. You can wield swords, axes, hammers, bows, shoot guns, fire magic with a wand or spellbook, and all of it works. I dabbled in every playstyle, and none of them felt unbalanced or not worth using. I personally mained magic for the majority of the playthrough, and then my secondary, I would alternate between the best gear I had at the time. Usually it would be a sword in one hand and pistol in another. My main upgrade paths revolved around magic though. Upgrades felt pretty good. You level up at a decent pace and can increase a base stat and unlock an ability or upgrade a current one. It all felt good, and the upgrades did feel impactful. Some games definitely have upgrade systems that feel unnecessary, but luckily I was excited every time I leveled up. I felt a purpose to it, and unlocking new abilities, especially with my magic run-through, was exciting. I also want to quickly touch on the loot system of Avowed. It's a fairly standard loot system. There are different rarities of loot you can find, and some of it is categorized as unique, usually coming from quests or boss fights. Unfortunately, most of the loot felt fairly generic to me. Even the unique items would only have a small additional effect. For example, one of the unique axes restores 3% health for killing an enemy. That's just not exciting. On the bright side, the weapons and armor look really cool. So finally, let's talk about performance. I played on the Xbox Series X, and I'm recording on PC. The game looks visually fantastic. On Xbox, I had a fairly consistent 30 to 40 FPS. Occasionally, towards the end of the game, I would have a few hiccups, but nothing that ruined the experience. Avowed really shows the power of Unreal Engine 5, and is maybe the best example of it on console. So, to wrap up, Avowed is the ultimate example of jack of all trades, master of none. It does everything just average and doesn't excel in any one category. Unfortunately, the story is fairly generic, even if the overall themes really make you think. The gameplay was enjoyable, but the lack of an interesting loot system and spongy enemies stop it from transcending into the realm of the greats. Overall, Avowed isn't a bad game, but isn't necessarily what I was hoping it would be. I would give Avowed a 7 out of 10. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next one.